An expanse of tall, lush summer grass, punctuated with buttercups, spread across the field that led over to the cut. The cut itself was concealed by a long row of oak trees that seemed to guard the deep railway beyond. Natural protectors from the harsh, fast steel that channeled through the man-made cleave, carrying weekenders from London to a heady day by the sea. But even trees cannot protect young, inquisitive children who approach them with fresh eagerness, an eagerness that somehow deserts them as they are taken over by the troublesome teenage years. In childhood, trees are there to be climbed, and here, steep banks of broken bark and dry, sliding leaves entice them as they embark upon adventures in the sun-mottled darkness. I was 12 that year when we had our last family picnic at Steepdean. The field where we had come for years was just as beautiful as ever, and in the heat of June 1976, it possessed a summery beauty that seemed to contrast so plainly against the tragedy that happened here, a tragedy that protracted an idyllic day in the countryside into a sad and mournful autumn. My younger brother, Samuel, aged 8, hands sticky with dried orangeade, beat me in a running race to the edge of the field where the trees began. He may have been 4 years younger than me, but he was just as tall and his legs were powerful. He probably had more sugar than me too. Besides, I was a girl, and in my brother's eyes, girls could never be faster than boys. Though we were both out of breath when we got to the edge of the field, we wasted no time in seeking shade from the high sun, which pierced the perfect blue sky but could not penetrate the canopy of leaves. Samuel was already standing astride on the lowest branch of one of the bigger trees when I caught up, and while I bent over out of breath with the heels of my hands supported on my knees, he was eagerly climbing to the next set of branches. "Be careful," I shouted, knowing full well that my pleas would not be heeded. In fact, he was already on the next branch up and could probably see the village from his vantage point if he looked to the south across the cut. The railway below had been almost invisible to me, and when the sound of a diesel train started to rise in the distance to the east, it became obvious just how close to the track we were. Through the trees below us, the sun pinched the 4 rails. The ever louder churning of the oncoming train filled the day, and soon the smell of the locomotive was upon us, as was the train itself, a flat-fronted, yellow-faced, blue Class 48 with 8 passenger carriages plunged noisily past us. No sooner had it appeared did it disappear to the west, dropping us back into a silence punctuated by nothing but the sound of the church bell in the village tolling 2 o'clock. Samuel and I had been silent and unmoving while the train had passed, but this minor interlude, or the apparent danger it presented, did not stop my brother from boldly climbing to a higher part of the tree. "You should come down from there," I called, but the grin he returned to me displayed that a common stubbornness had possessed him, the kind of bloody-mindedness that usually ended up with grazed hands and knees, salty tears and ice cream. As he advanced further along a branch that seemed incapable of holding even his small frame, I thought these actions would end in tears. I had no idea that the tears would belong to my mother, my father and me. The moment it all started was when Samuel stopped suddenly, looking down and out in front of him as though he was eyeing a place to land from a jump that was both dangerous and stupid. "Don't jump, it's too far and the ground is sloped." But he ignored me and said nothing, and for a moment I switched my thoughts to the notion that he might have been planning a leap to the branch of another tree. Eventually he called down to me, "Claire, there's a girl on the railway line." Immediately I looked in the direction of his gaze. I couldn't see any girl, but my view would not have been as clear as his vantage point allowed. "Where?" "Down there," he shouted. "Get off the line, it's dangerous." I continued to scan the track, shifting my head to see behind the trunks of the trees that obscured my view. I began to panic as I simply couldn't see any girl. And then there came the distant rise of what was undoubtedly another Class 48 thundering along the track towards where we were. "There's another train!" shouted Samuel, pushing further out onto the branch, which promptly snapped, its crack echoing through the cluster of trees. In a rush of leaves, I heard him get the wind knocked out of him as his body plunged to the ground further down the steep gradient. He hit the slope with force, and I watched in steadfast horror as the weight of his body forced him into a fast roll. And the train lurched nearer, its roar growing like a menacing demon. Samuel's roll showed no signs of slowing, and he plummeted over a ledge where the gradient became steeper at the base, perhaps where the workers had cut a broader trench for the track to be laid. My brother was a tumbling mess of limbs that dragged dried summer twigs and leaves with him onto the track. I stumbled after him, my favourite summer dress smeared with dirt and riding up my legs. For a moment I saw a mental picture of our mother and father sitting in the field on our old tartan blanket, reading and sipping orange juice from the plastic beakers we always brought with us on these trips. They were completely unaware that Samuel was having trouble moving. He must have broken something. He started to lift his body on what was obviously a working arm, and that's when the diesel hit, both the smell of the stuff and the roar of the locomotive and the sheer, unadulterated power of the steel hulk that swiped my younger brother from the ground and bounced him into, well, I didn't see where, because the train, with its oblivious passengers, barreled on. After a few seconds, through which I stood, unable to move or think or breathe or comprehend anything of what had just happened, I heard the screech of the brakes that started to bring the train to a stop somewhere further down the track, probably close to Steepdean Halt. I read sometime later, during a long rainy day that autumn, in the local library, that a girl was once killed on the line near Steepdean Halt. There had once been a railway sidings in the Cleve just east of the Halt. It enabled downstream trains to pull into the side and wait, while more important upstream trains passed through. The girl who died had wandered onto the track in 1928, just after they had torn up the sidings and upgraded the line to receive a train in each direction. When Samuel was killed, he'd said he'd seen a girl, and after the train had passed, I was sure I saw her standing on the hill on the other side of the tracks. She was climbing with her back to me up the slope that would take her over the lip of the wide trench and into the field beyond, and eventually into the village. The police never found her. I told them everything when they interviewed me. I had no reason to lie. They told my parents that they'd looked for her, but after a while they'd stopped. In later years, I'd wondered if they had ever even started looking in the first place. Perhaps the proclamations of a shocked 12-year-old girl caused them to think that I had made up the little girl as some sort of excuse for what had happened. For a while, I managed to convince myself that such a concept could be true, and that I had deluded myself into not only seeing the girl climbing that opposite bank after the crash, but even hearing from my brother that she was there in the first place. Perhaps Samuel had just fallen out of the tree for no other reason that he was being too childish and bold, and he had been silent in the action. So there I was, 20 years older, standing at the edge of the field, looking down at the cut that was such a place of tragedy all that time ago, treading so much more carefully as the lancing stair rods of this wet day in late June had turned the steep bank into a slippery slope of mud and leaves. Feeling ever so slightly like the child my younger brother was, I clambered down the incline towards the very tree he'd ascended. My car keys were still in my hand, so I tucked them into my pocket and, stroking my hair behind my ears, I began to hoist myself up onto the branches above. My husband had suggested I do this as some sort of catharsis on this sad anniversary, but as I climbed I felt foolish and supremely glad that nobody was here to witness this pilgrimage. I was nowhere near as fast as my brother had been, understandably, but when I reached the safest part of the tree from which I could feel I was nearest to the precarious branch which had snapped and had now grown in a new and deformed direction, I sat a moment and thought about him. There had been no trains since I arrived, and the rain tapped hypnotically on the oak leaves, and yes, I cried. After a moment, my gaze alighted on the tracks below and froze. Was that a little boy I saw on the line down there, in between the wet, vertical trunks of this small, steep wood? The slight figure moved behind the trunk of one of the oaks below me, and I couldn't dare to shift my weight to follow in case I fell. I didn't see the boy again, but I began to wonder, was it possible that after the track was changed here, another form of siding was created by this little stretch of railway, a siding which contained people instead of trains, who were stuck, sometimes for decades, waiting for another to come along before they could be free to continue on their journey themselves.